Now, I'd like to welcome everybody to the May Speakers Series here, hosted by the Ottawa chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society. We are thrilled to have Jean-Luc Pilon as our featured speaker this evening. Jean-Luc was an archaeologist and still is an archaeologist with an over 30-year career at the Canadian Museum of History, participating in many exhibitions related to the archaeology here in the National Capital Region, as well as other displays. He's an adjunct research professor at Carleton University, and is a past president of the Ontario Archaeological Society and has also served as web editor for the Canadian Archaeological Society. He was born and raised just outside Ottawa in Van Cleek Hill and studied anthropology and archaeology at the Universities of Toronto and Laval, obtaining his PhD in 1986. Although much of his research has been focused on the people and the occupation of the Ottawa Valley and around the National Capital Region, his work tonight is going to be talking about Fort Severn and the existence of shipwrecks along the Hudson's Bay coast between those communities and the Manitoba border. Hudson's Bay Company journals describe and locate shipwrecks, and the land around that area has been rebounding from the last glaciation at a rate of 1 meter per century. So older wrecks will be found at greater distances from the current shorelines. His presentation will talk about some of the knowledge of Ontario's Hudson's Bay wreck and speculates about others that might still be high and dry, out of sight and out of mind, as he puts it. The Ottawa chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society would also like to acknowledge that we are hosting this presentation from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation, whose rich cultural attachments to this land reach back thousands of years. We recognize the Anishinaabe-Algonquin as the traditional guardians of this land and as customary knowledge keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed. We honor their culture, presence, and long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory. Further, we also pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. And with that, I will invite you, Jean-Luc, to begin your what I'm sure will be a fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for this opportunity. You know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, hold on. I've got a few to show you. And this forum, having the opportunity of doing it virtually rather than in person in downtown Ottawa is one that I jumped at because it means that I have the opportunity to talk to people from well outside the national capital area, but especially I'll have the opportunity of speaking to people from Fort Severn. And I know I saw the name of a person from Fort Severn, and I was told that there might be some people from James Bay, from the Moose Factory, who are interested in the topic. And I even saw a friend from Alberta who is sitting in and listening to this. So I hope that when I speak to a broad range of interests, that I am understood by everyone. I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm going to be talking about shipwrecks, and I don't know very much about ship, but bear with me. I appreciate the fact that you are listening. So the story begins. I'll give you some background. Here I am sitting in Gatineau, but it goes back to when I was a student in Toronto in the early 80s, and I was doing a PhD. And actually, before I got the idea to do the work that I did do, I took a course on Arctic archaeology, and I found it very interesting that about 3,500 years ago, peoples from the Arctic sort of moved down the west coast of Hudson's Bay, well into northern Manitoba and into even the forested areas. And at about the same time, people were moving down the east coast of the Ungava Peninsula. And it looked like when you looked at what was known about the archaeology of those regions, it looked like they stopped at the dotted little line of the provincial borders of Ontario. And I said to myself, that seems a little odd. Is there a way to find out what is the reason for that distribution? And so that's what initially got me interested in looking at far northwestern Ontario. So there is oh my gosh, he was young, eh? I started my work there in 1981, and those were the people working with me. On the left is David Matthews, who is from Fort Severn, and on the right, René Bélanger from Laval University, who was a student at Laval. And off we went, just going up the river and looking at locations to try to identify archaeological sites of any kind. And so the kinds of sites that we found were very numerous, and they were pre-contact sites. Now here you can see at the top left a fireplace or a hearth feature in the wall, and all of these lines here, they are old soils that were built up because of the spring flooding. Occasionally you get very high spring flooding and it lays down a layer of river silt, and people keep coming back. So inevitably we were finding pre-contact artifacts. So these are all stone projectile points or knives. And then we have some more stone tools here, some bone and some pottery, but pottery was very, very rare. So this was telling me about the ancient history of that region. But at the same time, you know, places that are good to camp on 1,000 years ago are also usually pretty good to occupy 500 years ago or 300 years ago or 200 years ago. So we would inevitably find material that had been obtained through trade with the European traders and that documented how people lived in historic times on the land. So here you have a series of pipes. These are all dating from about 1685 to 1690. And here you have some much more recent material, jackknives and files, but you also have files that are being modified into creating tools. This is some kind of a spear. So we did document this, and this got folded into our way of understanding the use of that territory by people in the past. Now, that was between 81 and 84. You know, you're young and you're idealistic. Now, in 81 and 84, I was told about shipwrecks to the northwest of Fort Severn, but I wasn't interested. My whole purpose in going to that area was to study the Indigenous history, the ancient Indigenous history. But in 2015, I decided to go back to Fort Severn to see if I couldn't this time delve a little more into the historic archaeology of the region. You know, there was a fur trade post on the Severn River in 1685, destroyed in 1690, and then they came back and put a new post up in 1759, just days before or after, I forget which, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, when the French and the English were at it yet again. Well, this post was built right here on the picture on the left, and it was continuously occupied. The white building that you see there is a Hudson's Bay Company store. So it's been continuously occupied for centuries, a couple centuries, and I wanted to learn more about how much of the site still existed. However, this road that you see in 2015 used to have about 50 feet of land to the left of it. It has since disappeared. And you can see on the right how the erosion is taking place and how the clay is literally oozing out of the embankments. So this was a source of great concern. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how serious this was. Now, in 2015, I had to relocate the original 1685 fort, which is upstream from Fort Severn. Now, in 1981, there were open areas because there had been logging that had exposed the site. There were surface scatters of bricks because the Europeans had brought a lot of brick into the area. But when we went back in 2015, it had all grown up. And I'll tell you, I left a pair of glasses somewhere in the bush there. It grew up. You can see the trees are young. It's a secondary growth. But luckily, the young man who was with me found a brick on the surface, and we were able to relocate the site. But much had changed in the intervening 30 years. Now, another thing happened in 2015, which I need to share with you, is that I met a lot of people that I had known back in the early 80s. For example, Dave Matthews, who's wearing the yellow hat here, I met him within the first hour that I was in Fort Severn. First thing you do after you get back from the airport is you go to the northern store before they close, because that's the source of food for people from out of town. And he was coming out of the store, and we embraced. We hadn't seen each other for over 30 years. And it just happened that within a year, Dave had passed on. So I had this absolutely incredible, wonderful experience and wonderful opportunity of renewing that contact with him. And there are some other people in this crowd from 1982 who just coincidentally showed up at the airport the day I was leaving, and we got that group picture. That was a very momentous, brief but momentous trip. In 2016, I went back, and this time with the intention of doing some excavations at the earlier fort, the 1685 to 1690 HBC post, which had been reoccupied just beside it by the French for a few years. And so we went there, and once again, we're looking at the slope in front of the modern store to see what materials had come down. And we're talking to elders who are giving us information about the locations of sites in the area. Here, Mr. Thomas is holding a mammoth or mastodon, I'm never sure which, tooth that he found upriver from Fort Severn. I cannot quite understand what it's doing there, but there's no question about the identity of that tooth. So these are some of the excavations. You can see clearly we're looking at a European occupation here, or at least it's European material. This is possibly a floor beam or a joist that we exposed. And then in 2017, I went back yet again with the intention of learning more about some of the sites that I had been told about in 2016. One of the things that was really critically important in 2017 is the gentleman with the red t-shirt on had been talking to me about these shipwrecks and really wanted me to come out and have a look at them. He wanted to share his knowledge of these and to see what I could bring to the table in terms of identifying what they were. And at this time, four-wheel drives, ATVs, are available, common, and as you'll see in a moment, quite useful in this terrain and environment. And so this time, Catherine Davidson came with me. She ended up doing her master's thesis based on her experience and the collections that came from the HBC, from in front of the HBC store, so from 1759 onward. Now, just a brief little word about the Hudson Bay lowlands. It's a most wonderful place. It has all sorts of very interesting game and resources. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But before I get to the shipwrecks and the land itself, a brief note about the changing environment there and why it's important to this story. Geologists, geomorphologists tell us that up until 15,000 years ago, the continental glacier basically covered all of Canada under a very thick mantle of ice. And it had been like that for tens of thousands of years. Starting 15,000 years ago, it starts to melt. But what that means in a practical sense, and here you can sort of see the outline of Hudson and James Bay, and where you've got these darker colors, that is the thickness of the ice. So in sort of southeast Hudson's Bay, and Ngava Peninsula, it was over 4 kilometers thick. Here in the Hudson's Bay lowlands, just south of Fort Severn, it's about 3.5 kilometers thick. And then you can see it's very thick in Nicky Waiton in the barren lands. So all of this weight, the massive ice, it depresses the Earth's crust. Just like a long piece of steel. If I had a piece of steel that was this long and an inch thick, I couldn't change its shape. But if it was 20 feet long, I could probably push it with my hand and it would give. Same thing with the Earth's crust. It got pushed down a very significant amount. When the ice started to melt, it started to rebound and to take its former shape. Now, if you look here, Churchill, 8,000 years ago, the shoreline was over 250 meters higher than it is today. So that means it's way inland. And the land has been rising ever since. And it is still rising. In fact, at Cape Henrietta Maria, in this area, the relatively modern rate of rising is 1 over a meter, nearly 1.25 meters per century. At Churchill, over here, it's about 75 centimeters. So 3/4 of a meter every century, the land will rise. It has slowed down very significantly. So for example, with that kind of a rate of rebound, and it's exceedingly flat, and you'll see some pictures of that in a moment. Well, since it's so flat, you raise it just a little bit, you're adding a big strip of land to the northern part of Ontario. Now, here's Fort Severn, Partridge Island, but you might be able to make out some lines here. Now, this is a little closer look at the lines, and you can see, actually, you can see trees on them. The nice light green color is probably caribou moss. Mosses and lichens, very, very open. In between those beach ridges, it's very poorly drained. You'll get swamps and bogs and little lakes. So this is what one of these beach ridges look like. And it goes back a fair amount. Very open, very sandy. They're absolute highways for animals like caribou, but they're also today really good surfaces on which to travel with ATVs. And this is what happens in between those beach ridges. You get poorly drained, poorly sorted soils. I once crossed, in 1981, we went on to Hudson's Bay in a boat and went up a river, the Pikwatan River. And I was walking from one beach ridge to the next. I had hip waders on, so that wasn't a problem. And I was alone. That was stupid. I'm walking and I noticed a little tree. You see these little stunted trees. And it was about 10, 12 feet away from me, but it was shaking with every footstep. And I said to myself, don't stop. Because I think I was walking on a floating bog. I don't know how thick the deposits were, and I don't know how much water is underneath. So that didn't seem to me like a very profitable way to carry out field research. And this was the boat that we had. So, and I said that it was flat. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. So basically, this is where the tide had come up. And then you saw how far out you would go, and it's exceedingly flat. And this is the characteristic of that coastline. Okay. Now, another characteristic of the coastline is, of course, the animal life that exists there. Now, this is a very particular animal. It's obviously a bear. That is a 9.5 size 9.5 foot beside it. You'll notice that the bear paw has claws out. And this suggests that it's not a polar bear, but instead it may be a grizzly bear. And it seems that grizzlies are not extending their range from the barrenlands into at least the coastal reaches of parts of northern Ontario. So this is putting a new squiggle on on the line here. So that day, when I went with Kustachin, who brought me out to see these shipwrecks, we saw polar bears. We saw, I believe, I counted 32, but we came home in the dark, so I probably missed a few. The polar bear population is impressive and something to see. Of course, Hudson Bay lowlands is also known for the migratory waterfowl. The Mississippi flyway is funneled through here. Incredible fisheries and caribou. Caribou come into the coastal area to give birth to their calves, get into the wind, and try to keep some of the bugs away. So now we can get to the sites themselves. Again, I'm going to ask your indulgence. Pardon me if there are especially people who know something about ships. I will not. I'm going to try to use the best way to describe them as I can. And just keep in mind that when we were going along here and I was looking at these things, I had no idea what they were. So since you know, going with Chris and Catherine Davidson in 2017, I've had a chance to do some research on these and try to identify what some of them might be, and this is what I'll present to you as well. So I'm not going to do them in order. I'm going to start with site number 2. You'll see the method in my madness very shortly. Now, when we're going along the coast, we're going along literally along the water's edge, and at a distance, I see these great squared timbers in a sort of a fan formation, leaning in towards the bay. And my first thought, I'll be honest with you, is I said to myself, oh, look at that, an art installation. Somehow, somebody got some money to come and create an artistic presentation here on the shores of Hudson's Bay. But as we got closer, we saw that obviously it was not that. But initially, I couldn't understand it. So you have a series of squared timbers in a line, general alignment here, at various angles falling down. You also have a cross member here that is attached to this. There is a second one that we cannot see. We can just see the end of it where it attaches to the second vertical. And then they've got these very large bolts protruding from below. So the bolt is tied on, and you've got an extensive amount that is projecting forward here, suggesting that they are holding on to something very substantial. I didn't do any subsurface testing. All we did during our brief stops, you know, we were gone 14 hours or so, leaving around noon, getting back at 30 in the morning. It was time enough to take a few photographs, take some rough measurements and a couple notes, and then go on to the next. And you can see how we are right at the water's edge. We're just above. So this probably gets, you know, during higher water episodes, it probably gets wet. And you can also see how far Hudson's Bay, you know, with the lowered tide, how far out it actually goes. So these are the bolts. This is serious business. So they're attaching something substantial that should not and will not move. You can also notice some of these bars, iron bars, coming out at various angles. Now, some are going, oh, how shall we say, perpendicular to the alignment, and others are parallel to the alignment, like this one and this one. And these, I concluded, were some kind of cross brace. And so you start to ask yourself, what are we bracing? Why is it so substantial? What could it possibly be? Let's look at one of those cross braces. Well, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. This is a 1932 photograph. This is in front of Fort Severn. And this is a landing or a dock or a wharf that is put in to receive the annual supply ship from York Factory. When you go through the journals, you see that every time towards the middle of the end of August, this is when they install these uh, these dock facilities, and then after the sloop or the schooner has come and unloaded and then taken all of the furs, up it comes. So this is something that is being assembled and disassembled, at least at Fort Severn. The same can be seen. This is York Factory in northern Manitoba. Very long ramp. You had to get out to deep enough water. And it is not rare to read about the destruction of these wharves if they're left in by spring flooding. This is another look at the wharf. You can see the cross bracing is very serious. You can just imagine the volume and the weight of material that is offloaded and then put back onto these ships. So this is, I think, good candidates. And we can see some examples in earlier times at York Factory. Now, when I say that in the springtime, the flooding can be serious. This is just a couple of weeks ago in Fort Severn. These photographs were taken by Chris Kostachin with a drone, and you can see how this is looking towards the south. The river is flowing from top to bottom. And you can see how the river is all free here, but all of the panels on either side of Partridge Island are being plugged up by ice jams. And now the bottom photograph, you're looking towards Hudson's Bay, which is still solid. So it is damming up there, and that is where you get water rise. Suddenly it can rise 10, 20, 30, 40 feet overnight. It can rise that much within an hour or two. And again, this is something that you can read about in the journals. And occasionally, Fort Severn, they talk about using canoes to go between the buildings, the post. So it's a very serious issue. So anything that is lying along the shoreline, such as a wharf, would of course be destroyed. Now, the last thing I'll say about that is that York Factory was abandoned by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1957. They closed it for good. It had been there for 230 or more years. And if you think that the Hudson's Bay Company said to themselves, oh, we should go remove the dock before we leave, I don't think so. I think there are good chances that that last dock at York Factory in northern Manitoba eventually got washed away into Hudson's Bay and brought down the coast and wound up northwest of Fort Severn. At least that's my interpretation of it. Now we're going to look at the sites 1 and then sites 3. Now site 1 that you're looking at here, actually the feature is just to the right of the star. And it shares something in common with the Great Wall of China. It can be seen from space. You can just make out a square or a rectangle with a protruding arm right here. This was actually the first of the shipwrecks that Chris showed me. It consists of a wall of squared timbers. They're about 10, 12 inches across. It is a rectangle. You have a partial wall in the center. You see how it is open here. You've got this drum. It's some kind of a ratchet with chains attached to it. It's in a support here. There might have been a second one there, but it's pretty broken down. At the front, you've got this massive, I'm going to call it a winch. I'm not sure the actual technical term, but I'll describe it in a moment. Again, you see massive hardware. This is a structure that is having great stresses applied to it. That's about all I can say without knowing what I'm talking about. You can see how the wall goes down and there's a bit of a ledge. So there's like 2 tiers for some reason. If you look at the front here, there's that extension that you can see from space. And you also have some lateral extensions which are lower down, and unfortunately we couldn't make out very well. But they go out about 3.5 to 4 feet on the sides. This sticks out about 9 feet. The corners of that rectangle are heavily reinforced with these iron bands. They're about 2 feet on each side and about 4 inches high, and all of the corners are reinforced that way. And so this contraption, connected to the roller, if you wish, there would have been some kind of a bar inserted here in order to turn it. And these plates seem to receive something that would have prevented it from turning on itself. So it's a massive, strong, very, very reinforced and strong mechanism to prevent this roller from turning on itself. So it's supporting and holding something back, is all that I could conclude when I saw this. I had no idea what I was looking at. And this is a look from the back. And you can see the first compartment here, and you can see the second one with its corner bracket right here. So it's not in as great condition. You can also see that it's higher at the front and slopes down, and it's embedded into the sands. Now, this beach ridge that it is on is about the first or the second from the waters of Hudson's Bay. So it's at a certain distance and a certain height. So it's older, for example, than, for example, the wharf, if indeed that's a wharf, that I say. Now site 3, and site 3 is very similar in that we've got these tumblers or these rollers. We have the same kind of very heavy metal crank or winch mechanism at the end here. We have a double support with a second roller here. Again, a long rectangular frame, but there is a second frame that is embedded in the sand. We could only see it. It's wider by perhaps 3 to 4 feet on either side, which is interesting. So there's the first one, and again, you see the multiple chains. There was also a third compartment, which is in very poor condition. But between the second compartment and the third, there was a space, a gap of about 3 to 4 feet, where there was not that boxed-in structure. And then the last thing to point out are these bollards. And these bollards certainly indicate that this is a maritime vehicle of some kind. This is used to tie it up and to secure it, either to a dock or to another vessel. There's some of the iron wire or whatever. Now, after I got back, I tried to figure out what, for the life of me, could this be? I contacted people at Parks Canada. It went nowhere. I Googled the living daylights out of it. I got nowhere. I even wrote and contacted people at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, thinking that perhaps, there had been whalers in Hudson's Bay, and perhaps there was some contraption that whalers would have used that could be explained, that could explain this. And I came up with nothing. Well, one day I shared some photographs with Robert Grenier of Red Bay and many other places fame, and Caroline Marchand, and they said, "Have you thought of a barge?" And I said, "A barge? What on earth is a barge doing here?" This is just another look. And yes, a barge is a perfect fit. You can see how there are different compartments. There's a walkway along the side. They can be longer at the ends. It was just starting. The comparisons were very, very good. So a barge of this kind is not used to transport goods or equipment or whatever. It's used to clean and dig channels in rivers. So you have a dredger, which will one way or another get material out of the bottom, put it in the barges. The barges go out to sea and they dump it. There's another look at an earlier barge, yet another. And a barge of this kind, they're called bottom dump barges. They're really, really interesting because here you can see that there's a mechanism on the side to crank up the chains. And then there's a pulley of some kind that goes down in the middle to open and close a door. So that door is opened when they are out to sea, a place where they feel they can unload their load, as it were, and then they're closed up again. So the only difference with the two wrecks that we just saw is that they have a roller in the middle or a tumbler in the middle, which would have opened and closed the door. In fact, we saw some of the chains that were still attached. So this is a cross-section of a bottom dump barge. And so on the sides here, these are basically to give the flotation, to float the vessel. So there's a narrow passageway, which corresponds quite well with what we saw on the ground. Again, we didn't do any subsurface testing, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did follow the edges to find something along these lines. If we could go into the center and to dig down, we might find this kind of a narrowing space with a door or some kind of a trap. So what on earth are barges doing on Hudson's Bay? What muckraking was going on here? Well, it just so happens that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Canadian government wanted to find or to create a deep water port that could serve as a way of bringing Canadian wheat, Western Canadian wheat, to international markets. And they were not only seriously considering, but they started work on developing Port Nelson at the mouth of the Nelson River as that deep water port. And everything was tickety-boo. This is a Popular Mechanics 1914 article that talks about the dredger that was built in Toronto and somehow navigated all the way to Hudson's Bay, brought to Port Nelson. And this was, as it says here, the largest suction dredger ever built in Canada. Imagine. And they made it to Port Nelson in 1914. And well, in 1924, there was a storm, and it wrecked this dredger. It not only wrecked the dredger, but you'll notice here the last sentence, some craft used as lighters, barges, were destroyed. If you go to Port Nelson today, you can still see Canada's largest suction dredger sitting on an artificial island. And I believe that those lighters eventually made their way to this region and wound up on those beaches, the second beaches of Northern Ontario's coast, northwest of Fort Severn. The port facility, by the way, that was planned for Port Nelson actually now is Churchill, Manitoba, because after in 1927, when they saw the difficulties, they had another study, don't you know? And they recommended that the train shift to Churchill, and the rest is history. All right, so now we're going to look at numbers 4, 5, and 6. They're close together, and I believe they relate one to the other. Oh my goodness. They are about 3/4 to a kilometer, 3/4 of a kilometer to a kilometer from the active beach of Hudson Bay. They are on the second or third beach in, so we're quite a distance. So that means that there's a lot more time has passed. Here you can see all sorts of wood remains. You can also see some metal. These are called iron knees. We'll get a better picture in a minute. These are the ribs of a wooden hull, wooden hull ship. You can see some of the planking. The wood is starting to deteriorate. This may be part of the keelson. It matches the keel on the inside of the ship. There are all sorts of nails and wooden nails. Here's some of the planking on the interior, would have been the interior. This, clearly the ship is flattened, the hull is flattened, but this would have once been attached here, and all you can basically see the curvature of the interior of the ship. Well, there are different aspects, and I'm sure ship specialists would say, hey, look at that, that's one of those. And these are really pretty heavy, big pieces of cast iron, and there are several of them that are still there. You also have brass nails and iron nails. The reason why you have the two is because the brass were used at and below the waterline. They would not corrode as much as the iron, which were above. All right, well, that's nice. And there you can see how those iron knees are used. So there's supports that are added to support the decks. You also have wooden ones, and we saw one or two of those as well. Now, a fellow by the name of John McPhee, I know I'm bouncing around a bit. He used to be with the Ontario Lands and Forests as a biologist. He was working for a few years in the summer times. He was around the coast near Fort Severn. And he published in 1991 this book, Hudson's Bay Watershed. In fact, the McMichael collection has just opened an exhibition called Hudson's Bay Watershed of his photographs, because he was, photographing people in the 1950s and 60s and in ways of lives that have radically changed today. So they're priceless photographs that he donated years ago to the Ontario Archives. In 2017, I was on my way back from the OAS conference in Brantford, and I went to Owen Sound, where Mr. McPhee lived. I had contacted him earlier. I forget how finding him wasn't very difficult. And he welcomed me into his house. He shared with me all of his memories, his photographs, and he even had his notes out to go over with me while I was there. And again, I threaded the needle in 2018, less than a year later. John McPhee had moved on, had passed away. So we had some great exchanges, and these are some of the photographs that he shared with me. You might recognize this piece of wood. It's the thing that I think might be a keelson. Here's that knee that was still standing and sticking up. But at the time that he was there in 1955, well, yes, this was about 2 or 3 weeks before I was born. That's a scary thought. Anyway, there used to be an anchor there, and the anchor is now in Fort Severn, near on the road to the airport. So there's some more views of some of the pieces that he saw. So that was site 4. We'll go to site 5. Again, you're looking at a section of hull of a wooden sailing ship. So this is basically the middle of the ship here. These would be the ends of the ribs, and these are the tops of the ribs. Here you've got, again, a couple, 2 or 3 of these iron knees, and then you've got something else here. These are rods, they're not flattened pieces. The bevel on these planks suggests that we're looking at the stern, the back end of the ship. There are those knees, nice angles, and here you've got these, they're about 1 inch, 1.5 inch rods of cast iron. Some wooden nails, and some of these knees have marks on them to suggest that they were tailored for different spots on the ship. So they were made to fit. And this is what's at the end of one of these rods. It's a dead eye. Now, these rods are called pane plates. And the dead eye, of course, is to attach ropes that hold the masts. And so you would have had several of these for each mast on either side of the ship. And this is more or less how it works. This is the outside of the ship. So you've got these rods with the dead eye at the top. And this is John McPhee's photograph of the very same place, but in 1955. You could see, again, that dead eye, his knees still standing. And now we're going to go to the last of these sites. Again, you have iron knees. There's a lot more vegetation covering, but we did find marks, numbering Roman numerals on the angles of these knees. And we found at least one dead eye. Now, what is this boat all about? There was a compilation of Hudson's Bay Company wrecks, the fur trade fleet, published in 2011, Anthony Dalton. He got most of them, not all of them, but looking through that, I came to the conclusion that there are two or three possibilities to explain this particular shipwreck. The best fit was a ship called the Cam Owen. And so I got curious and I Googled Cam Owen. Well, the HBC record archives in Winnipeg have information on the Cam Owen. This is a description of how it got caught in a storm near Cape Patton in northern Manitoba, and it was wrecked. Nobody died, but they had to abandon the ship, and eventually the ship was taken by high tides and disappeared into the ocean. So Cape Patnam is here. The ship was going from York Factory, and it had its accident here, and it wound up possibly here. Now, why do I think it wound up there? Because this guy, James McDougall, he was an inspector, he was a chief trader and an inspector for the Hudson's Bay Company. He's also an amateur photographer. Many photographs at the Hudson's Bay Archives in Winnipeg that he took, including, if you look at number 19, wreck, Cam Owen, number 21, from the deck. What was number 20? Because there's only two photographs that are attributed to the Cam Owen. And this is one of them, and you see how it's sitting obviously in very shallow water. You can see how the gouvernail is gone. The back end of it has been ripped off. It has suffered pretty serious damage. And this is a photograph he took on the deck. And look at these rods, these chain plates with the dead eyes sitting in. Another thing to note is that the tops of the ribs that usually would have formed some kind of a railing are all snapped off, just cleaned right to the base. That's possibly very instructive. It suggests that something happened. I'm proposing that maybe the ship tumbled with breakup, ice rafting, storms, whatever. This has all been snapped and broken, and how these pane plates, 1.5 inches, cast iron bent like spaghetti. Who knows? There's another thing that's important in the Hudson's Bay Archive records for these two photographs is they say that it was found at Sandy Head, Hudson's Bay. That's what's in the catalog. Now, when I was talking with John McPhee in Owen Sound in 2017, he pulled out this photograph. He says, that bump there, he says, look, it is so flat along the coast that anything that sticks up can be used as a landmark, gets a name. And this particular place was called, and I'm abusing it, and I apologize, Ostiguanaco, which he apparently had a certain knowledge of the Cree language, means something like sand head. It refers to a head and it refers to a hill or some sand. And Chris Gustachin has told me a name that was very similar to this. And apparently it refers to skulls. being found along the side of the shoreline. So McDougall was telling us this is at the same place basically as John McPhee had noted. So that's very interesting information. Now, so that I think is the identity of that ship. There's no question. There are other shipwrecks along the Northern Ontario coast. The Fort York, for example, in September of 1930, was forced to run itself aground to save life and limb. And here is where it was in 1955. Now, Hudson's Bay is out there a little bit. In 1955, once again, John McPhee, just to be funny, that's him up the mast, took a couple photographs. And when I saw him in 2017, he told me how the hunters from Fort Severn used to come into this area to hunt a lot of migratory waterfowl. But according to them, the geese were staying away because of these masts, and they wanted to burn it. And the company wanted to keep it because, well, you know, when you're navigating along a flat coast like that, any landmark, and these were great landmarks, told them that they were approaching the mouth of the Severn River. So apparently a deal was struck that as long as the masts are standing, we leave the ship alone. The masts fall, it's all yours. Well, today, this is the approximate location of the Fort York. There you can sort of make out its outline. And again, thanks to Chris Bisachin, this is what it looks like today. So it is no longer an encumbrance to moose hunting. Other ships that I found references to in the journals of the Hudson's Bay Company, dating to 1817, that's when the Britannia was wrecked, and the Porcupine in 1820. Now that was a picture of the Britannia, a painting of the Britannia by somebody who never saw it. So I don't know how close it is. This is, you might recognize the Camoan, and these ships, both the Porcupine and the Britannia, were used as sources of materials. You know, there's a lot of good iron there, and iron was a very expensive commodity. There's also a lot of very good hardwood, a lot of good lumber. And in the 1820s, there are many references to sending people out to the Britannia to get some metal or going to get some hardwood. So these were known places for good raw materials. And here, clearly, apparently, I heard that these knees, the shorter ones anyway, were great anvils. And so if you could manage to haul them home, you had a good working structure. All sorts. So what does this mean in terms of trying to make some sense of it? You look at the circulation patterns of the waters of Hudson's Bay. And in the western part of Hudson's Bay, you've got this circulation that is bringing things in a counter-clockwise direction right along the coast between York Factory and Fort Severn. And it's even stronger in the fall. And these changes in patterns, circulation patterns, have to do with, you know, the amount of water that is rushing into Hudson's Bay in the springtime and how it changes, and then the weather patterns and the wind patterns with the seasons. But it certainly explains why you're getting a lot of material that is coming out of these big rivers in northern Manitoba and being redistributed along the shores of Hudson's Bay in northern Ontario. So just a reminder of where York Factory is. Port Nelson is over here, Cape Putnam, and then where the wrecks are winding up. All of these instances, be it the Camoan, the barges, even the dock, people assumed that once it got washed out to the sea, that it would wind up in the bottom of the Hudson's Bay, and nobody would worry anymore about it. Many years ago, when I was still at the museum, I was contacted, and I suppose I could find it somewhere, but there was some people interested in finding the ship, the Pélican, in 1697. Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville. Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville, very interesting guy. About 10 years before, he was with the Detroit expedition that went from Montreal to James Bay. In fact, go figure. Uh, war, France and England were at war. They wanted to take some Hudson's Bay Company posts. So somebody had the bright idea to sneak up behind them. Well, sneak up behind Fort Albany, you have to walk over land for weeks and weeks. They did it and it worked. D'Iberville was one of them. D'Iberville came back to Hudson's Bay in 1690. In fact, the first post, Hudson's Bay Company post on the Severn River, was burnt by D'Iberville in the end of August 1690. 6 years later, he's back on Hudson Bay. He wants to take York Factory. He goes there and there's three big British ships, warships, lots of cannons. What does the story go? There were 118 to 44 gun advantage. So the British were looking pretty good, but D'Iberville nonetheless sank one gooted and saved itself, and the other one he took it and sacked it, pillaged it. But in the process, and this is described by Peter C. Newman as the greatest Arctic Sea battle in North American history. Well, it's probably the only one, but don't worry about that. In the process, the Pelican was hit, struck, and damaged. So he had to run his ship ashore. And this group from the States were looking for it. And I think they were using a lot of very modern technology to try to detect where this ship might be. And I'm wondering to myself, why would the Pelican be any different from any of the other ships, wharves, barges that wound up being washed away by the rivers? And that perhaps the Pelican is to be found on the Ontario shores, way inland, away from the modern day waters of Hudson Bay. There are a lot of things that we don't know that could find themselves out there on those beaches, and with the new techniques of being able to travel on the land with ATVs, the possibilities are really pretty incredible. Not only to learn about the Europeans associated with the various parts of the fur trade and the like, but also about the people. Whenever you read in the journals about the hardships of, the people who were on the Porcupine that had to walk and blah, 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 you say, my God, what did they have to put up with? Well, between the Hudson's Bay Company posts, there were packets, there were letters being written and exchanged, and there were people walking from York Factory to Fort Severn and then on to Fort Albany regularly, but they were Indigenous people, and we don't actually learn very much about the hardships that they had to undergo, which, of course, they did. The dangers were the same, and if not even different. So there's all sorts of stories that are still hidden there, have been for a long time, and remain to be learned about. A lot of this information probably still or already exists, but we haven't had the ears to listen to it. So I think on that, I will stop. I've had more than my 1,000 words. If there are questions, I would certainly entertain them.